Welcome back to Climate with Kiana. In today's episode, I speak with Xaver Kandler, campaigns director at New York Renews. New York Renews is a coalition working to further legislation to support climate, jobs, and justice in New York State. In this conversation, we discuss policies including the Climate Leadership and Communities Protection Act, the New York Heat Act, the Just Energy Transition Act, and the Climate Superfund Act. So enjoy this episode to hear about the power of grassroots organizing and coalitions to further climate action through policy. Here's our conversation. Could you introduce yourself and the work you're doing a little bit with New York Renews?
Yeah. So my name is Xaver Kandler. I am campaigns director at New York Renews. And New York Renews is a really unique coalition within the United States. And we call ourselves a climate, jobs, and justice coalition. And what that means is we really have three pillars to our coalition. We have environmental justice organizations, we have labor unions, and we have more traditional climate groups. Of course, we also have, because we have 380 organizations across the state, we have organizations kind of all shapes and sizes, multi-issue community groups, faith groups. But those three pillars are really kind of the core of who New York Renews is. And New York Renews really came together after the People's Climate March in 2014, which was this really unique moment, not just because it was the largest climate march in world history at that point, but also because it brought together so many different kinds of groups that hadn't always worked well together, right? So we had these like big climate organizations, with hundreds of employees, and we also had labor. We had a lot of indigenous groups, nations and tribes represented there, and environmental justice groups. And so after putting that together, some of the core organizers, they sat around and they thought, okay, well, like it's great to have a march, right? Like it improves visibility, like it brings all these people in. But what we really want is like to, reduce emissions and, increase environmental justice. And so we then went on this road trip across New York State, and we stopped at 80 different, cities, towns, municipalities, and asked people and asked community groups, like, what does environmental and climate justice look like for you in New York State? Like, what would you actually want to see passed? And that then led us to actually formalizing into New York Renews. We drafted a policy platform. I can talk a little bit later about where that policy platform went. And we adopted the Hamed principles for democratic organizing and just came up with a set of New York Renews principles. And so that really kind of became the foundation of New York Renews. And that was back in 2016.
Amazing. Yeah, 380 organizations is no small feat, particularly when they are so diverse, as you said. And I want to talk more about that. But yeah, I was going to say that the People's Climate March was definitely like a foundational moment for me too in my climate journey. I was like interning with them and did organizing, was like out in the street canvassing for that march. And then also like,
I don't think I knew that about you.
Yeah, it was, I guess, my first semester of college, and I like brought like organized a whole group from my school to come to the march. And I just feel like that experience of the march and then the energy of how many people were there was like really just like an important moment in my young organizing journey. And I feel like I saw other young people have a similar moment with that with the march last September here in New York, which was still huge post-pandemic, but much smaller than the 2014 one. But yeah, and we also, just to say, we met while we were both interning at the same environmental justice Oregon college. So I just appreciate you in my climate journey as well. And I think seeing the work of New York Renews was just like really inspiring to me. For briefly, I haven't been as involved, but like going up to Albany when I did to advocate for the different pieces of policy we're going to talk about. So I'm just like, all that to say, I'm like deeply appreciative of the work of New York Renews, and it's great to like hear that journey of how it started again.
Totally.
But I think
I'll just really quickly say
yes, yeah.
before you move on, which is just to say that was actually a really important moment for me too. Like I was at the 2014 March, and like I will never forget when just like looking down the street, it just looked like it went forever with people. And then there was that moment of silence and then kind of that like uproar, and being like, that was the first time, having like grown up when the narrative was really like doom and gloom, right? This is like pre Green New Deal. This is pre like kind of a lot of the visioning work that people had done. And at least in the spaces that I was in, like it was like, this is like terrible was the kind of the big message. And that was like the first moment where I was like, oh, we can like win it. Like we can like build the future we want. And I think that was the moment for so many people. So it's so sweet. I didn't know that you were there, and that kind of we had that shared connection of that being such a pivotal moment in our climate journeys.
And I agree of that moment of the moment of silence and the uproar was really powerful, and similar to kind of I think what I deeply appreciate about New York Renews is that moment of, in that kind of context of a march where there's so many people, you're just feeling your connection to so many people and such a diverse group of people. And I think that's really beautiful. And like you were saying that you felt more doom and gloom at the time, just generally, I think so much has changed in the last 10 years. And I think about like my limited climate education in high school. And then I was teaching a workshop to high schoolers in the last few months who were all like super engaged with New York Renews and with local climate work. And there's just so many more opportunities, I think, for young people to get involved. And there's so much more hope and optimism because there's so much amazing work happening. So I think that's just like a lovely moment to reflect on and see how the work has expanded. And, New York State has been a leader in many ways, very much thanks to the work of everyone on the ground and New York Renews bringing people and stakeholders together. So yeah, it's a great thing to reflect on, truly.
Yeah, totally. Well said.
Yes. So I guess let's just dive into talking a little bit about some of the policies and the impact that New York Renews has spearheaded, which is a lot. So I'm imagining a good place to start is the CLCPA, the Climate Leadership and Communities Protection Act. But also, if you want to start in a different place, go for it. But I think of that as foundational in the evolution of the work.
Yeah, totally. And that goes back to what I was saying about like when we came together, we crafted that vision, and a core part of that vision was what has became New York's climate law, the CLCPA, as you said, and so maybe what I'll do is I'll just quickly tell the story of how we got the CLCPA, and then I can dive a little bit into what it is. We crafted this. Really this vision that, then became a bill, and it passed for multiple years in the New York State Assembly. But every year we were unable to get it to pass in the Senate. And at this point, the Senate was actually like controlled by the Republicans, even though that there was a majority of Democrats in the state Senate. And so after the 2018 elections, when the state Senate flipped, there was this huge moment, not just for climate and environmental justice, but really like across New York. And everyone knew like this could be the year that we really pass this transformational piece of legislation. And so 2019 was this really big rush moment. And I had actually just started at the beginning of the year working for one of the steering committee members of New York Renews, Environmental Advocates NY. And so I was actually loaned to New York Renews during the final push to help organize our final action. And kind of as we got closer and closer to the end, we had these hearings all over the state. We had really built up this like groundswell of public support, and it was being talked about in the media as like, this kind of like must pass piece of legislation before the end of session. And so about a week before the end of session, Governor Cuomo, who at that point had actually proposed his alternative to the law, which was a much weaker version that he called the Climate Leadership Act. And we were pushing what was at that time called the Climate Community Protection Act, the CCPA. And so about a week before the end of session, he said, we're just not going to get something done on climate. And that's because he, wasn't willing to accept like a really kind of progressive climate law, both that's ambitious, but also really prioritizes environmental justice communities. And so we had this really big action where we brought about 400 people to Albany, and we did civil disobedience right outside of his office and really kind of hammered home the narrative that if something didn't happen on climate, it was on the governor, and it was really Governor Cuomo's fault. And
I think I may have been
he came
there
back
at civil disobedience. Yeah.
Yeah, it was an amazing moment. Like, I think it really was one of those moments that will like stick with me for the rest of my life. And you could like feel the power in the room. Like we were so close, and we could feel how close we were. And then he came back to the negotiating table, and right before the end of session, after a lot of negotiations between the governor, between the assembly, and between the Senate, we ended up with a pretty good version, a version that we were really happy with. It didn't have everything, and that is indicated by also the name of the law. We were trying to pass the Climate Community Protection Act, and it ended up being the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, the L being for Cuomo's ego. And it was this historic moment. And I remember waking up the next morning and going to the bodega and just seeing on the front page of the New York Times, like, New York passes like nation's most progressive climate law. And that moment being like the moment it sunk in, like, oh wow, like we changed history. Which all begs the question of like, well, what is New York's climate law? And like, why was it so unique? And I think that it really comes down to kind of two ways. The first is that it was just really ambitious. So it was, it's all sectors of the economy. A lot of the laws before then were, just the electricity sector or, just related to buildings or something like this. And the CLCPA is, across all sectors. And, setting ambitious timelines, needing to be at net zero by 2050. And really just developing an entire state apparatus with the Climate Action Council and other entities to really implement the law. So that was the first part. But the second part was also that it was the first law that really brought together climate and environmental justice at the scale that it did. And so I think, one of the kind of premises of New York Renews is the belief that not only is doing environmental justice and climate together the right thing to do, but that it is the politically savvy thing to do. And it's the strategic thing to do. And I think that really proved that hypothesis because it, established the environmental justice investment mandate, which became the basis for what folks are calling Justice 40 at the federal level, which says 40% of investments for our transition need to go to environmental justice communities. But it also established environmental justice screens, created a disadvantaged communities map that we helped shape and is out now, and really like shifted the landscape that if you're going to do something on climate, it really has to be hand in hand with environmental justice. And so I think that's like really one of the big lasting legacies of the New York climate law.
Absolutely. And I think what's so powerful is so many of the individuals and organizations who contributed to the advocacy that allowed this to pass are all, small grassroots local organizations that are oftentimes focused on just improvements in their own communities and beyond, but all of that from that local work and passion, so you said, led to influencing federal policy on that level and really sort of changing the landscape of how environmental justice is being included and thought about at a high level in this country. which to me just ties back to just how deeply important grassroots community organizing is and has been historically to contributing to large level system change. So I guess I'm curious to hear a little bit in your role, your experience working with all of the different members of the coalition and organizations and community members, and how you experience that impact, kind of rippling out from the local level to much larger scale.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I feel like you put it really well about like the kind of foundational role of grassroots organizing. One thing we always say is organizing gets the goods. And when we think about all different kinds of power, like my fundamental belief is like organizing power, people power is really the foundation of all of that. And I think that was seen also, to go back to the example of the climate law, was, like the groups in New York Renews spent time over years really building up a base of support specifically for this law, right? So it wasn't just like, oh, our community says they want this, but they don't actually like know what this is, right? It was taking the time to really be deeply embedded and engage with community around what this would look like and what this could do, for each community, knowing that was different. And so I think that, the role of a coalition really fundamentally is to bring together different kinds of power and, to bring together different stakeholders. And, of course, there's organizing power I mentioned. There's also disruptive power. There's legislative power, right? Like you can't pass legislation unless you have relationships to legislators and you know how to, write policy or, have access to folks who do. And of course, then there's, narrative power. How can we make our narrative common sense? And I think that, what we do as New York Renews is we bring together all those different kind of groups and figure out alignment towards what it is that we all want to fight for together. But fundamentally, behind all of that is the people power, and it is the power of organizers really deeply engaging and building leaders around climate. And I think that's something that we've seen a big shift around in the climate movement over the past 10 years. Is people really realizing, you can build a base of people that are really, really energized and invigorated by climate and environmental justice. People used to always say like, the only people who care about climate are people who are like intellectually concerned or, what have you. But it's like, at this point, that's not true. People are engaged. When you talk to people on the street, people are really worried about climate. And with that comes this immense opportunity for us as a climate movement to really be engaging with people on a day-to-day basis around what these transformations could look like for their lives.
Yes, and it's interesting because I think some of the perceptions around environmental work or environmental justice work often being siloed has just sort of been a narrative issue historically, right? That's just disconnected from actually how diverse the environmental movement is and the people who care and are doing this work. And I do think that is changing for the better. And there is more kind of integration between different facets of the movement, whether that's, like environmental justice, conservation, energy, like all of these things are, I think, intersecting more given how deeply interrelated all of these challenges are, and we need all the different perspectives and experiences and expertise to craft equitable, inclusive solutions.
Totally.
Yeah, I had another guest on the show say that like a budget is a moral document when we're talking about policy, and I also just thinking about kind of how the allocation of funds in the climate law to EJ communities, what that really means, because a lot of it's you see big numbers, millions of dollars, billions of dollars, a big emissions targets reductions, but all of that boils down to real impacts that communities are feeling. And I guess with that said, now that it's been a few years since we've had the climate law in place, what are some of the, I guess, wins we're already seeing from it, but also on the flip side, implementation challenges to such an ambitious law?
Yeah, it's such a good question. And I'll just say really quickly one thing to your last point before answering it, which is I think you spoke really eloquently to like the kind of changing nature and the changing narrative of the climate movement. And I think one thing that is interesting is that, people have always viewed the climate movement as really white. And I think one of the underlying assumptions is that because white people care more about climate change. But the polling shows the exact opposite. Black and brown folks and Hispanic people consistently poll as caring so much more about climate change and about environmental issues generally. And so it's this really interesting narrative where there's all these people that are saying, well, the climate movement is historically white just because that's just kind of a natural, way based on what people think, but that's actually just 100% the opposite. And so I think as we think about that and we think about where do we want to organize and how do we want to build power over a long-term perspective, it makes more sense actually to be organizing the people that care the most about climate change, which in this country are more Black and brown people. And so I think that just speaks to the kind of difference between the what you call like the narrative and the facts on the ground. So just wanted to share that because I think you spoke so well on what is a very counterintuitive kind of dynamic in this world we live in. So
yes, and there's also more work needed for those who haven't, been engaged in the environmental justice space or don't have understanding around that to understand how justice and equity are so deeply intertwined and can't be separated from environmental issues, right? So I think there's just need for more thoughtful engagement kind of no matter where you are in the movement to bring people together more and have more understanding of how we can best support each other.
Totally. So well said. I think, one of the big things that has been a challenge, but it also really represents a huge opportunity is the investments. And so the climate law, the CLCPA is really about, setting the goals, setting up the framework, changing the laws. But in addition to the big policy and regulatory changes that need to happen, which are immense and are transformational, there is also just a need for a significant amount of money going into our communities to really transform every aspect of our lives. And we're not going to reach the mandates in the climate law unless we are making those investments. And we've seen over the past 5 years that New York State fundamentally has not prioritized this and has not taken seriously the amount of investment that is needed. And as a result, we are not going to be on track to meet our investments unless to meet our mandates, unless there are serious investments starting next year. And so one, kind of thing that helps us set this up is that in 2013, in the New York State budget, was included a really important item called the Climate Action Fund. And the Climate Action Fund is this fund specifically dedicated to climate and environmental justice spending that has that 35% investment mandate with the 40% goal that I mentioned earlier. But it also has a ton of incredibly strong labor language in it. And it says that all monies that are created from the CLCPA shall, which is a language, but need to go into the Climate Action Fund. And that's transformational because that means any sort of money that's raised because of the CLCPA will go into this fund before it goes back out into our communities. And that means that through the legislature, we really have a say on where that money can go. And so that's ensuring, a big opportunity for us is ensuring that money goes to the communities that need it worst, the communities who are hit first and worst by the climate crisis. And also that this is an opportunity to really bring in new constituencies and new people who might not have previously cared about climate and environmental justice. And really show that investing in climate and investing in environmental justice is a winning issue, right? I think so much of the narrative that the fossil fuel industry is trying to create around the transition is to scare people about the costs of the transition. Oh, it's going to cost you like $100,000 to transition, your home, et cetera, right? It's like the price at the pump is going to rise. But we know actually that if we make these investments, that people are going to be saving money. They're going to have lower utility rates over time. And that these investments are also going to just lead to healthier communities. Fossil fuels inherently are just polluting where we live and poisoning the communities that bear the worst of pollution. And that these investments in particular have the opportunity to transform that. And so there is, a real case to be made that this is not only something that is, great for communities, great for the climate, but it's also a winning political issue. And I think that is the big place that we need to be putting a lot more of our time and energy into. In addition, of course, to passing, transformational pieces of legislation like the New York Heat Act, the Just Energy Transition Act, which we campaigned for this year, and the governor signing the Climate Superfund Act, which is a bill that recently passed. And so,
yeah, no, it's so important that the money actually goes where it needs to go. And like you said, in terms of the narrative from the fossil fuel industry about the cost of transitioning, a just transition, ultimately, all the investment upfront ends up resulting in lower costs over time because less people are going to be suffering from health conditions as a result of harmful energy infrastructure. So that's less medical costs, less costs to, adapt to climate impacts. So, it seems like a big cost upfront, but all of the projections show that this saves massively in the long term. And then it's a question of we need these, we need to hold the government accountable to investing this money so that the cost of the transition doesn't fall on those who are already being overly economically burdened by, energy costs or local pollution as a result of energy infrastructure. So how do we protect ratepayers and protect vulnerable communities, vulnerable to like predatory funding practices around this. So yeah, I think it can maybe seem kind of overwhelming in terms of the scope, but all of these policies are ultimately just going to be benefiting the long-term kind of financial health for everyone, hopefully, is the vision. But I guess with that said, could you talk more about, which you just mentioned a little bit, the Climate Jobs and Justice Package, which has a few of those policies you just touched on? Kind of would love to. I know also that's kind of more ongoing with some of them being passed, some not yet. So would love to hear more about that.
Yeah, it's a great question. So after passing the climate law and then fighting for a couple of years on different pieces of legislation, New Yorker News took a step back and we thought, okay, so to continue to implement the climate law, we really need a package of bills that we think are really the most critical bills to getting New York on track to hit our mandates. And so we went through a process in 2022, leading to the 23 session, to put together the first iteration of the Climate Jobs and Justice Package. And as part of that, included what ended up becoming the Climate Action Fund that I mentioned earlier. It also included the Build Public Renewables Act, which was a public power bill that passed in 2013 as well. And then a number of other bills.
2023, yeah.
So after we, got those two big ones in 2013, we thought, okay, it's time to reassess the Climate Jobs and Justice Package and relaunched for next year with slightly different bills. And so out of that, we had our budget demand, which we call the People's Climate Justice Budget. And that really goes to the investment pieces that I was talking about just a minute ago. And it was a list of projects actually developed by our community members that we knew would have major climate impacts, health improvements, and also improve, local communities. And so we pushed for that. And then we also pushed for 3 pieces of legislation. The Climate Change Superfund Act, which fundamentally makes polluters pay for the mess that they got us in by putting a fee on retroactive pollution, just like a normal Superfund site, right? Where like a polluter pollutes the site and then they have to pay for those damages. Same concept, but you just apply to the climate. And that actually passed this year. It passed at about 4 a.m. on Saturday morning of the final day of legislative session. It's a huge victory, and I think is really important because at this point, the fossil fuel industry, they're trying to do the sneaky thing where they're saying it's going to cost you so much money, and then you say like, well, why are you not paying for it as the people who got us here? And they're like, oh, but we could never do that because then we'll just like pass them, it all onto you, while they of course continue to make record profits. And so what this does is the bill is structured so it's on past harm, and so the costs can't be passed on to consumers, and it makes them pay and invests in infrastructure to make the climate crisis a little more manageable. And then the second bill is the New York Heat Act, and that really is about transforming our heating and cooling systems and saving people money. And so it's right now we have this system that really prioritizes gas over other forms of heating and cooling. And so what it would fundamentally do is it would say all forms of energy should be on an equal playing foot. And people shouldn't be subsidizing new people getting on the gas system when we know that all that money we're investing into the gas system is soon going to be stranded. It's going to be what people call stranded assets. And then we're going to have to pay for that down the line. And so right now it's actually, if you live within 100 feet of a gas line, the entire rate paying system will pay for you for free to hook up to that gas line. And the New York Heat Act, among other things, ends that. And then the final thing that the New York Heat Act does is it says right now people are paying way too much for energy, and especially low and moderate income households. And so it caps the amount of money that folks will pay for their energy, for their utility bills at 6% of their income. And that would save New Yorkers tons of money. And we actually have at New York News, we did this in-depth analysis with Wind Climate. We found by area how much people would save. And, sometimes it's tremendous amounts. It's over $100 a month, which is, a really significant amount of money for folks who are struggling paycheck to paycheck. And then the bill is the Just Energy Transition Act, or we call it JETA. And JETA is all about transforming the peaker plants, the plants that only run sometimes, that are located almost entirely in environmental justice communities, shutting them down and transforming them into the next generation of energy. And so that's really a key priority for environmental justice communities and for New York News. And so this session, we're able to pass the Climate Change Superfund Act alongside NYPIRG and a lot of other great organizations. But the New York Heat Act and the Just Energy Transition Act both passed in the Senate and died in the Assembly. And so, it's really incumbent right now on the Assembly to pick itself back up and then really pass these pieces of legislation, because the Assembly was really the leader when it came to the CLCPA, and now has become the place where climate legislation goes to die. And so, this has been a really radical transformation, and I think next year will hopefully represent a really big shift back to the Assembly prioritizing climate and environmental justice.
Yeah, there's so much political uncertainty. I mean, kind of the landscape is always changing. And it's interesting also just to see between states kind of what is successful and what isn't. And a lot of it sometimes can be just about how something is framed, or like the name of the policy, even if it's saying the same thing, right? Like there's just so many um just people to appease in a sense to get something to pass. But yeah, interesting to see kind of what ends up moving faster and what doesn't, but would be super transformational to have that cap on energy bills. And peaker plants have been such a massive issue, particularly here in New York City. And natural gas has gotten there's been so much PR money, campaign strategy poured into it by the natural gas industry. And so there's a lot of misconceptions in terms of it being a bridge fuel or something we want around, but we don't. We want it gone. It's not helping our health. And yeah, okay, shifting a little bit, having kind of gone over all the different policies you're working on, I'm curious in your experience with all the different organizations, and I know New Yorker News also works with a lot of young people to bring them into the movement, like what you see as people's kind of different motivations or driving motivations coming into this work. Because as you said, whether they're coming from a labor union perspective, or maybe even like a faith group, or different kinds of environmental groups. Do you see different perspectives in coalition members coming in, and how that contributes kind of to the larger picture of this work?
Yeah. It's interesting. I mean, people really do come to it from such different places. And I think we're seeing that also shift over time. Like, I think when you and I joined the climate movement, was a very different time, and people were seeing very different amounts of destruction in their kind of daily lives. And we had a youth day of action this year with Triage, which is an incredible youth climate organization based in New York City. And we had a share out while we were up in Albany, and pretty much everyone there has suffered through some sort of climate disaster in their schools, whether that's it being flooded during Ida, or right now as we're talking with a massive heat dome over New York City. I don't know about you, but I'm currently sweating. So it's real right now. And I think
Yes.
that people that are growing up at this time all really feel just the weight of the climate crisis already being here. But I think that people come to it from so many different places. Like, we have a pretty strong faith contingent in New Yorker News, and obviously they have a unique perspective on creation care and the morality of what we're doing right now. Of course, you mentioned the labor perspective. That's another big one. There's a whole world to build that's based on union labor and is based on good green jobs. And we know that these policies create tons and tons of jobs. And that's why when you hear people talk about climate change now, if you ever hear Biden talk about climate change, he's just talking about jobs, right? And that's another big perspective. But I think that one common thread that maybe isn't shared by everyone, but I think is shared by many, and is definitely something that I feel deeply in my soul, is is that almost everyone has had that moment where they realize that climate change is one of the biggest threats humanity will ever face, and maybe the biggest challenge of our lifetimes. And I personally believe it is, and I think so many people have had that moment. Whether it's seeing a climate disaster, or it's reading something or watching something where you can really feel this is we're in such a unique moment in human history where we actually are still able to stop this. And every single little bit makes sane difference in the big picture, knowing that even just 0.1 degrees of warming difference is, millions of lives. And so, I think that the motivations coming together is honestly one of the most beautiful parts about a coalition, about a work, because in that you really see everyone's humanity, which is like why we're all doing this together.
Absolutely. And the magnitude of sort of the existential or even spiritual threat or crisis that emerges from this can be intense at times, which is why I think it's so important to like ground in also all of the joy, hope, and optimism that there is in this work, which seeing coalitions such as New York Renews and people come together on that scale, I think that definitely gives me hope and optimism. And I just love to hear what is bringing you hope and joy in this work, because I also think to stay doing this kind of work in a sustained long-term way, you really do have to find the joy and love of it as well.
Yeah, well said. I'll share, but I also am so curious what brings you hope. But yeah, I'll say the thing that brings me the most hope really is people power. It's knowing that there are just so many more of us than there are of the fossil fuel billionaires, and knowing that fundamentally the vast majority of people want a livable planet for themselves, for the people they love, for their children and grandchildren, and knowing that there will come a time where we are united and we will build the world that we want to live in. And I feel that that just belief deep inside of me. And I also think to see the way that the world adapts into, the resilience of people, but also the resilience of the natural world is always a place that I go to when I'm, in the darkest moments, when it's really late at night and the budget's still not done and it's not looking good. I think that's like one of the places that I go. But I think the final thing that I'll say is, I think a lot of people build their foundation or they build their work on hope, and hope comes and goes. It's like any other emotion or any other thing in the world. And relying on hope as a foundation, as opposed to relying on a deep commitment or relying on a will, I think is an unstrategic thing to do, because hope will come and go. And if in the moments where you don't have hope, then your foundation comes crashing down, that's a shaky place to be. And so I think, to me, it's like, it comes to a belief, like a belief in people power, a belief in the resilience of this world we live in, and less like a hope that everything will work out, because it's here right now. It's about the degrees in which we're able to make a difference. And it's not like, will climate change destroy us or not? Which I think is, the binary thinking of the world we live in. So, in some ways it's kind of a rejection of the question, but in some ways I think it's, that's like what I built my foundation on.
That makes sense. I appreciate that. I think that the world has faced a lot of huge existential challenges historically, and I think this is a really long-term movement. Like, the work is sort of never done, as you said. So like the hope will come and go, and so many other, parallel movements for justice have seen their ups and downs, right, over time, where there's huge wins and progress, and then sometimes things kind of slide backwards before they move forward. So I do sort of trust in the long-term movement towards progress, even when there's, challenges, hiccups, things not moving fast enough along the way. But I see the work towards having a thriving, healthy environment as crucial to have space for kind of the fullness of the human spirit and for us to all experience joy, right? Like it's harder to be joyous when
Mm.
there's so much in climate disaster, or right, all the different challenges we face. So yeah, I think I am really uplifted by how beautiful the community is of people in this work, both kind of friends and colleagues who care so deeply, and everyone is truly looking to, I think, help uplift and support each other. Like there's just not, I think, maybe a sense of competitiveness you might experience in other fields where there's a sense of we're all working towards ultimately the
Mm.
same goals. So like how do we support each other even if we're in different facets of the work? And yeah, I mean, all the innovative solutions that people are working on inspires me. And I think also like climate people are fun. And as a friend said to me recently, let's party like the world's on fire because it is. Sorry. And how can we I mean, I say that jokingly, but like, how can we make room for joy and community that like nourishes our spirit while we're doing this work? Because I think that is equally important.
Totally.
Yes. I guess sort of a final question here, but yeah, what are you, I guess, looking towards the future, what do you hope to see, whether that's kind of more specifically in terms of New York state policy or just the movement as a whole? What are you looking forward towards in this work?
Hmm. I'm looking forward to seeing the world that we build through this transformation, and everyone seeing that it's like a much better world. And it's not like, oh, we're going to have to make all these sacrifices, but it's actually like, we're going to work less and people are going to be healthier, and like everything's going to be cheaper. And this transformation is going to necessitate a lot of changes that I think may make billionaires less rich, but will benefit all of us. And I'm really looking forward to seeing that transformation. And then on a granular level, I'm looking forward to billions of dollars in investments next year. So let's get that money. Let's get that money for our communities.
Yes, very exciting. I'm involved in some clean energy work that will, benefit directly from that funding. So I am equally excited. Thank you so much for your time, Xav. If there's anything else you want to share, feel free.
No, just
Well,
super
great.
appreciate the time and also all the work that you do and the conversations that you hold with people. So
Thank
it's really
you.
sweet.
Well, I appreciate you, and I'm looking forward to seeing the ongoing impact of New York Renews and how that local impact ripples out, and that we can inspire change in other places and also be inspired by other change. So thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.